The cold, pre-dawn light of Washington, D.C. seeped through the heavy curtains of the hotel suite, casting the room in a palette of muted grays and deep blues. Pam Bondi stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a porcelain mug of black coffee. Warming her hands, her gaze fixed on the distant, ghostly silhouette of the Supreme Court building. It stood against the nascent dawn, a marble temple of reason and finality. In just a few hours, she would walk up its iconic steps and enter that temple, not as a tourist or a spectator, but as an advocate, carrying the weight of a dozen states. On her shoulders, the air in the room was still, charged with the electric potential of the day ahead. Anya Sharma, her sharp, young associate, sat at the large mahogany table, her face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. Stacks of legal binders and color-coded files formed a fortress around her, a testament to months of tireless preparation. Every statute, every precedent, every possible permutation of the justice's questions had been dissected, analyzed, and rehearsed. Yet, despite all the preparation, the outcome of the case, Florida et al. v. United States, hinged on a single, slender file that lay apart from the others. Placed deliberately in the center of the table, it was a simple, unassuming, manila folder marked only with a cryptic, handwritten code. Anya looked up, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. "Are you sure about the timing, Pam?" Holding it back until the Chief Justice presses the historical precedent angle. "It's a high-risk, high-reward strategy. If he doesn't take the bait, we might not get a clean opening." Pam Bondi turned from the window, a thoughtful, calm expression on her face. She walked over to the table and placed her mug down on a coaster. Her movements were deliberate, measured, betraying none of the immense pressure she felt. "It's the only way, Anya. The power of this isn't just in what it says, but in when it's said. The Solicitor General will build a beautiful, logical, and compelling argument for federal necessity. He will paint our position as archaic, an obstacle to progress in a digital world. The Chief Justice, as an institutionalist, will be naturally inclined to agree. He values stability, predictability, a federal standard. He will press us on why the states believe they can handle this complex issue piecemeal. He will build a cage of logic around us, and just when he thinks the door is locked, that's when we show him the cage was an illusion all along. We can't lead with it. It would be just another piece of paper in a mountain of paper. It has to be a direct, surgical response to the very foundation of their argument. It has to be the answer to a question he believes is unanswerable." Anya nodded, her apprehension giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. She had been with Ms. Bondi for 3 years, and she had come to trust her mentor's instincts implicitly. They were not the instincts of a gambler, but of a grandmaster in chess, seeing the board not as it was, but as it would be 10 moves from now. The case concerned the Federal Data Privacy and Security Act, or FDPSA, a sweeping piece of legislation that had been passed by a narrow margin in Congress. The law aimed to create a single, unified standard for how tech companies handled consumer data across the United States, preempting a patchwork of emerging state laws. On its face, it was a laudable goal. The government, represented by the brilliant and respected Solicitor General David Chen, argued it was a necessary exercise of Congress's power under the Commerce Clause to regulate an industry that was, by its very nature, interstate and international. But Bondi and the coalition of states she represented saw something else. They saw a vast overreach of federal power, a trampling of state sovereignty, and a law whose true purpose was not just privacy regulation, but the creation of a centralized data infrastructure accessible to federal agencies in ways that made them deeply uneasy. Their argument was rooted in federalism, in the principle that the states were not mere administrative districts of Washington, but sovereign entities. The hours ticked by. The gray dawn gave way to a crisp, bright morning. The city came alive, with the hum of traffic and the purposeful stride of 1,000 government workers. News vans had already begun to stake out their positions on the plaza in front of the Supreme Court. Pundits and legal analysts were broadcasting live, their voices a chorus of speculation. Mark Donovan, the veteran anchor for a major news network, stood before a camera, the marble columns of the court gleaming behind him. "We are live from the Supreme Court of the United States," he began, his voice resonating with practiced gravity, "where in less than an hour, oral arguments will begin in what many are calling the most significant federalism case of the decade. At stake is the Federal Data Privacy and Security Act, a landmark law that could define the future of the digital economy. The Solicitor General, David Chen, is expected to argue for a broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause, while former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, representing a coalition of states, will argue for a stricter, more traditional view of states' rights. All eyes, however, will be on the man in the center chair, Chief Justice John Roberts. His vote is widely seen as the fulcrum upon which this case will turn. Inside a nearby studio, Julian Croft, a sharp legal analyst with a reputation for seeing through political spin, offered her take. "Mark, the challenge for Pam Bondi today is immense. The tide of modern jurisprudence, especially in matters of technology and commerce, has flowed in one direction, toward federal solutions. The Solicitor General has a powerful tailwind of precedent. Behind him, Ms. Bondi will need to do more than just make a compelling philosophical argument about the 10th Amendment. She will need to convince at least 5 justices, and likely the Chief Justice himself, that this specific law is not just an overreach, but a fundamental departure from constitutional principles. It's a very, very steep hill to climb." As the clock ticked past 9, Bondi and Anya made their way to the court. They walked through the phalanx of cameras and reporters, offering only a polite good morning to the shouted questions. The air inside the building was cool and hushed, smelling of old paper, floor polish, and the weight of history. The Great Hall, with its busts of former Chief Justices, was a gauntlet of silent, marble gazes. They were led to a small, ornate council room. There, they met with the other attorneys from their team for a final, quiet huddle. There were no grand speeches, just a calm review of the strategy, a confirmation of the roles each would play. The focus was entirely on Bondi. She was the tip of the spear. At precisely 10 o'clock, a buzzer sounded. A marshal's voice echoed through the hall. "Oyez, oyez, oyez. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court." The 9 justices emerged from behind the deep red velvet curtain and took their seats on the raised bench. In the center, Chief Justice John Roberts settled into his chair, his expression composed and serious. He was a man deeply conscious of his role as the steward of the court's integrity. To his right and left, the other associate justices arranged their papers, their faces a study in judicial neutrality. Yet, for those who knew how to read them, there were subtle tells: the slight, anticipatory lean of one justice, the skeptical set of another's jaw, the intense focus in a third's eyes. The Chief Justice looked down at the advocates' tables. "Mr. Chen, you may proceed whenever you're ready." Solicitor General David Chen rose, his confidence radiating from him like a physical force. He was in his element, a master of the appellate arts, his voice clear and steady. "Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," he began, "the digital world knows no state lines. A person in California can have their data processed in Virginia, stored in Oregon, and breached by a hacker in a foreign country, all in the span of a single second. The patchwork of state laws that was beginning to emerge in response to this reality was creating a chaotic and unworkable system for consumers and businesses alike. Congress, acting squarely within its authority under the Commerce Clause, passed the Federal Data Privacy and Security Act to bring order to that chaos. For the next 30 minutes, Chen laid out his case with masterful precision. He fielded questions from the justices with ease, weaving together precedent, history, and modern technological reality into a seamless and powerful argument. He cited Wickard v. Filburn, the classic case establishing the broad reach of the Commerce Clause. He argued that the cumulative effect of disparate state data laws placed an undue burden on interstate commerce, justifying federal intervention. Justice Kagan leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, the petitioners argue that this isn't just about regulating commerce. They see it as a broader regulation of data itself. which they say has traditionally been a matter of state police power, like regulating public records or privacy torts. Where do you draw the line? At what point does the federal government's interest in commerce swallow up all traditional areas of state control? Chen nodded respectfully. A very important question. Justice Kagan, the line, we believe, is drawn by the nature of the activity being regulated, and here, the activity is inherently economic and interstate. Data is the currency of the modern economy. It is bought, sold, and transferred across state lines constantly. To regulate the handling of that data is to regulate the channels of commerce themselves. This act does not regulate what a person can write in their private diary. It regulates how a multinational corporation engaged in commerce across all 50 states must handle the data it collects in the course of that business. The connection to commerce is not incidental. It is direct and substantial. Chief Justice Roberts interjected, his tone more probing than adversarial. But Mr. Chen, what about the history? For most of our nation's history, matters of privacy and personal security were left to the states. The petitioners argue that the FDPSA represents a radical shift, moving the federal government into a role it has never occupied. How do you respond to the argument that this is a structural change to our federalist system, done not by constitutional amendment, but by statute? This was the heart of the matter, and Chen was ready. Mr. Chief Justice, the principles of our federalist system are enduring, but their application must adapt to the world we live in. The framers could not have conceived of a global network where information travels at the speed of light. They did, however, give Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states. They did not place a technological expiration date on that power. The core activity here is commerce. The fact that the commodity is digital data does not remove it from Congress's purview. To argue otherwise would be to suggest that the Constitution is frozen in the 18th century, unable to cope with the challenges of the 21st. We believe the framers intended the Constitution to be a living document, its principles applied to new realities. Chen's presentation was flawless. He concluded his time with a powerful summary, leaving the impression that the state's position was not just legally weak, but practically unworkable. A nostalgic plea for a world that no longer existed. A quiet murmur went through the public gallery. The momentum was clearly on the government's side. Then, the Chief Justice turned his attention to the other table. Ms. Bondi, Pam Bondi, rose and walked to the lectern. She arranged her notes, took a breath, and met the Chief Justice's gaze. The grand, ornate room seemed to shrink, the world condensing to the space between her and the 9 black-robed figures on the bench. Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, she began, her voice calm but firm, a contrast to Chen's smooth, flowing delivery. The Solicitor General has painted a compelling picture of a modern, interconnected world, and we do not dispute that reality. What we dispute is the constitutional conclusion he draws from it. This case is not about whether data privacy is important. It is about who decides. It is about whether the challenges of the 21st century will be met by concentrating more and more power in Washington, or by trusting the states, the traditional guardians of their citizens' health, safety, and welfare, to serve as the laboratories of democracy. She began by methodically deconstructing Chen's reliance on the Commerce Clause. She argued that the FDPSA was not a regulation of commerce, but a regulation of information. The Act, she stated, governs the collection, storage, and security of data, regardless of whether a commercial transaction ever occurs. It applies to a free social media app as much as it does to an online retailer. It is a comprehensive privacy code, a field of law historically and constitutionally reserved to the states. Justice Sotomayor leaned into her microphone. But Ms. Bondi, isn't that a distinction without a difference in today's world? These free apps are multi-billion-dollar enterprises. Their business is the data. How can the court realistically separate the data from the commerce? With respect, Justice Sotomayor, we separate it by looking at the actual text and structure of the law, Bondi replied, her tone deferential but unwavering. The Act's requirements are triggered by the mere collection of data, not its sale or transfer across state lines. It dictates internal security protocols, employee training, and data minimization practices. These are not regulations of the channels of commerce. They are internal corporate governance mandates. If Congress can regulate this under the Commerce Clause, then it is difficult to see what they cannot regulate. Any company that uses a computer connected to the internet would be subject to plenary federal power. The argument went back and forth. Bondi was holding her own, answering each question with precision and a deep command of the case law. She was calm, professional, and respectful. But Anya, watching from the council table, could feel the dynamic in the room. Bondi was playing brilliant defense, but she hadn't yet launched a winning offense. The justices, particularly the Chief Justice, still seemed to be operating from the premise that a federal solution was, in principle, the most logical one. They were testing the boundaries of her argument, but not yet buying into its core. Then came the moment they had anticipated. Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward, his hands steepled before him. His expression was that of a teacher patiently guiding a student toward the inevitable conclusion. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his office, "let's set aside the doctrinal nuances for a moment and consider the history and the practical reality. The states had their chance, did they not? For years, as this issue grew in prominence, the states produced a confusing and often contradictory patchwork of regulations. Some states did a lot, some did very little. A consumer in one state had robust protections, while a consumer just across the border had none. Congress stepped in to solve a collective action problem that the states, by their very nature, seemed unable to solve. Is that not a classic and historically accepted reason for federal legislation, under the Commerce Clause, to create a uniform, predictable national market?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. It was the linchpin of the government's case, the common-sense argument that resonated beyond the courtroom. He was framing the FDPSA not as a power grab, but as a responsible, necessary action to fix a broken system. He was building his cage of logic. Anya held her breath. This was it. Pam Bondi looked directly at the Chief Justice. She did not look down at her notes. Her voice remained perfectly even, yet it held a new charge. A subtle shift in intensity that made everyone in the room lean in. "Mr. Chief Justice, your question makes a critical assumption that the primary purpose of the United States Congress in passing the FDPSA was, in fact, to regulate interstate commerce and create a uniform national market." A flicker of impatience crossed the Chief Justice's face. "It is the stated purpose of the act. Ms. Bondi, it is written in the preamble. We generally take Congress at its word, do we not?" "We do, Mr. Chief Justice," Bondi replied, "unless there is compelling evidence to the contrary. Evidence that the stated purpose was a pretext for achieving a different goal. A goal that Congress may not have the constitutional authority to pursue directly." A deep, profound silence fell over the courtroom. Even the normally restless press gallery went completely still. The Solicitor General, David Chen, frowned, a look of confusion on his face. This was not a line of argument he had anticipated. Pretext arguments were notoriously difficult to win. They required extraordinary proof. The Chief Justice's eyes narrowed slightly. He was intrigued, but also skeptical. "That is a very serious charge, counsel. Are you suggesting you have something more than mere speculation about the motives of individual legislators?" Bondi's gaze did not waver. "I am, Mr. Chief Justice." She paused for a beat, allowing the full weight of her statement to land. The tension in the room was now a palpable, physical thing. "Mr. Chief Justice, with the court's permission, I would like to direct your attention, and the attention of the Solicitor General, to the supplemental appendix, which was filed with the clerk's office under seal late yesterday evening, and distributed to the justices' chambers this morning." A quiet rustle of paper swept across the bench as the justices, their curiosity piqued, reached for the thin document that had been placed on their desks. It had seemed like a routine, last-minute filing. Now, it was the center of a developing drama. Chief Justice Roberts, his expression still one of cautious skepticism, picked up the slender file. He opened it. Anya, from her seat, could see the top page. It was titled Declassified Memoranda, Select Committee on Digital Security and Privacy. David Chen, at the government's table, was visibly unsettled. He exchanged a frantic, whispered word with his deputy. A supplemental appendix filed under seal was highly unusual. That they hadn't been given more time to review it was a breach of custom, if not of formal rules. He looked blindsided. Bondi continued, her voice now acting as a guide for the justices as they read. Mr. Chief Justice, what you have before you are a series of internal, and until last week, classified memoranda from the Joint Legislative Drafting Committee that wrote the final text of the FDPSA. We received these documents just 72 hours ago through an expedited Freedom of Information Act request that was, after a long and arduous process, finally granted. These are not the words of opponents of the bill or of commentators. These are the words of the bill's own architects, written in private during the drafting process. The Chief Justice's eyes were scanning the first page. His entire demeanor began to shift. The professorial confidence, the air of gentle authority, it all began to recede, replaced by a look of intense, almost shocked concentration. His hand, which had been resting on the edge of the bench, froze in midair for a fraction of a second before slowly lowering. His face, normally so expressive and engaged, became a still, unreadable mask. He had stopped asking questions. He was just reading. Bondi's timing had been perfect. She hadn't just introduced a document. She had woven it into the very fabric of the Chief Justice's own line of questioning. She had made it the direct answer to his challenge. If I may, Mr. Chief Justice, she said, her voice cutting through the silent room, I would like to quote from a memorandum on page 3, written by the lead counsel for the drafting committee. He writes, and I quote, while our public justification will be rooted in the Commerce Clause and the need for a uniform privacy standard, our primary strategic objective is the creation of a centralized data repository. The privacy regulations will serve as the necessary sweetener to ensure passage and, more importantly, to establish the federal infrastructure for data access that we cannot achieve through a more direct legislative approach. Reliance on the Commerce Clause is, in this context, a functional pretext for an essential national security goal. A collective, audible gasp went through the public gallery. It was quickly suppressed by the stern glare of the court-martial, but the shockwave had already hit. The words hung in the air, stark and unambiguous. A functional pretext, the foundation of the government's entire case, the beautiful, logical edifice that David Chen had so skillfully constructed, had just been vaporized. It wasn't just a crack in the foundation. It was a stick of dynamite detonated in the basement. Chief Justice Roberts did not look up. He slowly, deliberately, turned the page. His face was pale. The other justices were equally transfixed. Justice Breyer was polishing his glasses, a nervous habit, as he reread a passage. Justice Thomas, who had been silent for the entire argument, leaned back in his chair, a look of profound, almost grim validation on his face. Justice Kagan looked across the bench at the Solicitor General, her expression a mixture of astonishment, an inquiry as if to ask, "Did you know about this?" David Chen was ashen. He was shuffling through his own copy of the appendix, his hands trembling slightly. He was a man adrift, his carefully prepared script now utterly useless. His entire argument had been based on the good faith legislative purpose of Congress. He had, just minutes before, told the court to take Congress at its word. And now, the very words of Congress's own drafters were being used to show that their public word was a deliberate misdirection. Bondi pressed her advantage, but her tone was not one of triumph. It was somber, as if she were revealing a sad, disappointing truth. On page 7, Mr. Chief Justice, the committee's chief of staff discusses the preemption of state laws. She writes, the preemption of state laws is not merely to avoid market confusion. It is critical to ensure that no state can create a data haven that would obstruct the unified access framework. We must occupy the entire field. This was never about cooperative federalism. It was about federal supremacy in a field historically left to the states. She let that sink in. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. The buzzing energy that had filled the space during Chen's argument had been replaced by a heavy, stunned silence, and finally, Bondi said, delivering the coup de grace, on page 12, in a summary memo to the committee chairman, the lead counsel addresses the very constitutional vulnerability we are debating today. He writes, the Commerce Clause argument is our most plausible, but also our most fragile. Should the true intent of the access framework be revealed during judicial review, the entire statute could be at risk. The narrative of consumer privacy must be maintained at all costs. She stopped. She had said all that needed to be said. She had not raised her voice. She had not used inflammatory language. She had simply read the words of the law's creators. She had held up a mirror to the government's argument and revealed its true face. Chief Justice John Roberts finally looked up from the documents. He looked past Pam Bondi, his gaze unfocused for a moment, as if processing a reality that had fundamentally shifted in the last 5 minutes. The man who guided oral arguments with such deft control, who was always 3 steps ahead in the intellectual chess match, had been brought to a dead stop. He looked at the Solicitor General, David Chen, and for the first time in the memory of most court observers, he seemed at a loss for words. The carefully constructed world of legal theory and precedent had just collided with a raw, undeniable fact, and that fact had changed everything. The silence stretched on, a full 10 seconds, an eternity in the rapid-fire environment of a Supreme Court oral argument. The Chief Justice cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Mr. Chen, he said, his voice now flat, devoid of its earlier warmth, do you have a response to these memoranda? David Chen rose to his feet, but he seemed smaller than he had an hour ago. The confident posture was gone, replaced by the defensive crouch of a man caught in a storm he didn't see coming. Mr. Chief Justice, the government was not. I have not seen these documents before this morning. I cannot speak to their authenticity on the spot, though. I have no reason to doubt counsel's representation. He was stammering, his formidable intellect struggling to find purchase on a landscape that had turned to quicksand. Beneath his feet, Mr. Chief Justice, the motivations of individual staff members, or even committee members, are not the same as the legislative intent of the full Congress that voted on the final bill. The text of the statute is what was voted on, and its text speaks of regulating commerce. It was a valiant attempt to fall back on the classic tenets of statutory interpretation, but it rang hollow. The memos weren't just from a few disgruntled staffers. They were from the lead counsel and chief of staff of the drafting committee. They described not a personal motive, but the core strategic purpose of the legislation. Justice Kagan leaned forward, her voice sharp. But Mr. Chen, this isn't just about motive. This is about pretext. We have cases. Munn v. Illinois comes to mind, where the court has looked behind the stated purpose of a law to see if it's a legitimate exercise of power. Ms. Bondi has just presented what appears to be, on its face, powerful evidence that the entire commercial regulation aspect of this law was a fig leaf for a different and perhaps constitutionally questionable goal. How can we ignore that? How can we, as a court, give deference to a legislative purpose that the legislature's own drafters admit is a pretext? Chen had no good answer. Your Honor, I would argue that the court should focus on the objective effect of the law, which is, in fact, the regulation of a massive interstate market, whatever the subjective intent of some drafters may have been. The law operates as a commercial regulation, but the argument felt weak, technical, and desperate. The courtroom buzz, once a low murmur of anticipation, was now a thrum of pure shock. Reporters in the press gallery were scribbling furiously, their faces alight with the realization that they were witnessing a landmark moment. They weren't just covering a case. They were witnessing the case turn on a dime, in real time. The narrative was no longer will the court uphold the FDPSA? It was how could the court possibly uphold the FDPSA now? The Chief Justice, having recovered some of his composure, turned back to Bondi. His expression was now one of grim seriousness. The intellectual game was over. This was now about the integrity of the constitutional process. Ms. Bondi, your time has expired, but I will grant you a few more minutes if you need them. Thank you. "Mr. Chief Justice, but I have nothing further to add," she said simply. The documents speak for themselves. She had done it. She had planted the seed of doubt, and it had blossomed into an unshakable tree of fact right before their eyes. She had not only stopped Roberts in his tracks, she had forced him to turn around and re-examine the entire path he was on. The rest of the oral argument was a mere formality. Chen's rebuttal time was a painful exercise in damage control. The justice's questions were no longer about the scope of the Commerce Clause. They were about the revelations in the memos. How were they declassified? Why was the government not aware of them? What was the nature of this unified access framework they mentioned? Chen, through no real fault of his own, had no answers. He was an advocate, not an intelligence officer. He had been sent to defend a law based on its public face, only to have its private mask ripped off in the most public forum imaginable. When the Chief Justice finally said the words, "The case is submitted," a collective breath was released in the courtroom. As the justices filed out from behind the curtain, the room erupted. The quiet decorum instantly dissolved into a cacophony of urgent whispers, the clicking of laptops, and the rustle of reporters grabbing their things to run outside and file their stories. Pam Bondi and Anya Sharma remained at their table for a moment, packing their files. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They exchanged a single look. A look that conveyed a dozen emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a profound sense of professional satisfaction. They had faced down the full power of the federal government and had prevailed not through rhetoric, but through a single, undeniable piece of truth. Outside, the scene on the plaza was one of controlled chaos. Reporters were speaking breathlessly into cameras, their earlier MEASURED analysis replaced by excited, rapid-fire reports. Mark Donovan, the anchor, had a look of genuine astonishment on his face. "We are getting astonishing reports from inside the courtroom," he said, one hand pressed to his earpiece. "Sources inside are describing a moment of high drama, a bombshell piece of evidence introduced by Pam Bondi that appears to have completely upended this case. We're told it consists of internal memos from the law's drafters, suggesting the law's stated purpose was a pretext. We are trying to confirm the details, but every legal expert we have spoken to in the last 5 minutes is in a state of shock. The consensus is that this changes everything within minutes." The story was the #1 headline on every news website in the country. The phrase "functional pretext" was in 1,000 headlines. On social media, the explosion was instantaneous. #ScottisBomb, #Bondi Evidence, and #Roberts Frozen were trending worldwide. Clips of courtroom audio, leaked by someone in the public gallery, were going viral. The 10-second silence from the Chief Justice became a meme, a symbol of an unassailable argument being brought to a screeching halt. Back in the television studio, Julian Croft, the legal analyst, was trying to put the moment into perspective. Her usual academic calm was replaced by a visible excitement. "Mark, I have been covering this court for 20 years, and I have never, ever heard of something like this happening. This is not just a gotcha moment. This is a substantive earthquake. To have evidence of legislative pretext of this quality introduced in this manner, at the most crucial moment of an oral argument, it's a legal unicorn." Pam Bondi and her team didn't just find a needle in a haystack. They found the secret blueprint of the haystack's construction. The Chief Justice's reaction, that visible freeze that everyone is talking about, was not the reaction of a man who was politically outmaneuvered. It was the reaction of an intellectual, a jurist, who had just been presented with a fact that fundamentally changed his understanding of the case before him. His entire argument for upholding the law was based on deference to a rational, good faith congressional purpose. That purpose was just exposed as a fiction. It's a decisive, strategic blow from which I do not see how the government can recover. The impact rippled out from the courtroom, through the media, and into the political sphere. Members of Congress, who had voted for the FDPSA, were suddenly on the defensive, besieged by reporters asking if they were aware of the true intent of the law. The bill's original sponsors released a flurry of statements, some claiming the memos were taken out of context, others deflecting blame onto overzealous staffers. But the damage was done. The public narrative had been irrevocably altered. The law was no longer the Consumer Privacy Act, it was the Pretext Act. In the quiet, wood-paneled solitude of his chambers, hours after the argument had concluded, Chief Justice John Roberts sat at his large desk. The clamor of the outside world was a distant hum. The afternoon light streamed through the tall arch windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Before him on the polished wood lay the supplemental appendix, its pages now slightly dog-eared from his repeated study. He wasn't looking at the legal briefs anymore. He was just looking at the memos. The words seemed to leap off the page. Functional pretext, primary strategic objective, unified access framework, narrative of consumer privacy must be maintained. His mind replayed the moment, the calm, steady voice of Pam Bondi, the weight of her words, his own dawning realization. It wasn't anger he felt, it was a deep, profound sense of institutional disappointment. He had dedicated his career to the law, to its processes, to the idea that the branches of government, while they may disagree, operate with a certain level of good faith. The memos felt like a betrayal of that principle. It was one thing for Congress to pass a law he believed overstepped its authority. He dealt with that all the time. It was another thing entirely for Congress to seemingly attempt to deceive the judiciary about the fundamental nature of the law it had passed. This was no longer just a case about the Commerce Clause versus the 10th Amendment. It had become a case about the integrity of the legislative process and the duty of the court to look beyond superficial justifications when presented with compelling evidence of misdirection. His legacy as Chief Justice, he knew, was tied to his stewardship of the court's legitimacy. Siding with the government now, in the face of this evidence, would make the court look like a willing participant in the pretext. It would undermine public trust not just in this decision, but in the court itself. He thought of Bondi. Her strategy had been audacious, a masterclass in legal timing and psychological warfare. She had gambled that he, John Roberts, would be the one to press the historical, good faith argument. She had read him perfectly. She hadn't just argued the law. She had argued the man. She had presented him with a truth so undeniable that it forced him to confront the chasm between the government's official story and its private reality. He picked up a pen. The final decision would not be written for months. There would be conferences with the other justices, drafts of opinions circulated, dissents penned. But in his own mind, in the quiet solitude of his chambers, the case was already decided. The trajectory had been irrevocably altered. The foundation of the government's argument had not just been weakened. It had been proven to be a deliberate fabrication. And in the face of such a revelation, there was only one path forward for a court bound by oath to uphold the Constitution. The undeniable evidence had not only stopped him in his tracks, it had laid down a new track entirely, one that led to a conclusion that was now, for him, inescapable. The silence that had fallen in the courtroom was not an absence of sound. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting, a legal universe reorienting itself around a new, immutable point of fact, and he, the Chief Justice of the United States, was the one who would have to navigate the consequences. He began to write, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the hallowed room, the first words of a judgment that had been sealed the moment Pam Bondi opened a simple manila folder. The public debate, the media frenzy, the political fallout would continue to rage, but the core issue in the still, quiet center of the storm had been settled. The evidence had done its work. The rest was just history waiting to be written. The political drama would unfold over the coming weeks, a spectacle of spin and damage control. Senators who had championed the FDPSA would hold tense press conferences, attempting to distance themselves from the damning language in the memos. Some would claim the staffers' words were hyperbolic, not representative of the final legislative consensus. Others would pivot, arguing that even if the initial motives were complex, the final law as passed was still a good and necessary one for the American people. The opposition, energized by the Supreme Court revelations, would call for hearings, demanding the testimony of the very committee members who wrote the memos. The public, meanwhile, would be caught in the crossfire of information, their social media feeds a battleground of competing narratives. Memes of a frozen Chief Justice would be juxtaposed with infographics explaining the Commerce Clause, and cable news segments would feature heated but respectful debates between constitutional scholars. Inside the Justice Department, David Chen and his team were engaged in a frantic post-mortem. It was a somber, difficult meeting. There were no accusations, only a shared sense of shock and professional dismay. "How did we not know about this FOIA request?" Chen asked, his voice strained. "How could we be so completely blindsided?" An aide explained that the request had been filed by a small, independent watchdog group funded by a consortium of civil liberties organizations, and the documents had been released by a different agency under a court order just days before. Bondi's team, through its own network of contacts, had learned of the release almost immediately. They had been outmaneuvered not just in the courtroom, but in the information war that preceded it. Chen understood it wasn't a failure of his legal preparation, but a failure of intelligence. He had prepared for a legal battle, not an ambush, for Pam Bondi and Anya Sharma. The days following the argument were a whirlwind of media requests and congratulatory calls from the governors and attorneys general of the states they represented. Bondi handled it all with the same unflappable grace she had shown in the courtroom. She turned down most of the television interviews, preferring to let the court filing speak for itself. In a brief press statement, she said simply, "We presented the facts as we discovered them. We have faith in the court's process and will await its judgment. Our position has always been that this law represents a significant federal overreach, and we believe the evidence presented reinforces that view. This is a vital conversation for the country to have about the balance of power and the importance of our constitutional structure." Her composure made her argument seem even more powerful. She wasn't gloating or taking a victory lap. She was acting as a serious officer of the court who had performed her duty. Months passed. The initial media firestorm subsided into a low simmer of anticipation. The court went on to hear other cases, and the public's attention was drawn to other headlines. But in the legal and political world, everyone was just waiting for the decision in Florida v. United States. The question was no longer if the states would win, but how they would win, and how broad the court's ruling would be. The biggest question of all was who would write the majority opinion. All eyes were on the Chief Justice. Would he assign it to another justice, or would he take it for himself? To write the opinion would be to put his own personal stamp on this historic rebuke of legislative pretext. Finally, on a crisp morning in late June, the day came. The courtroom was packed, an atmosphere of electric expectation hanging in the air. The justices took their seats. When the time came to announce the day's opinions, Chief Justice John Roberts cleared his throat and picked up the papers in front of him. "I have the opinion of the court this morning in case 23-145, Florida versus the United States." He had kept it for himself. A hush fell over the room. David Chen sat at the government's table, his face stoic. Pam Bondi sat at hers, her expression calm and attentive. The Chief Justice began to read a summary of his opinion. His voice was measured, academic, and devoid of the drama of that day in oral argument. But his words were devastating. "The powers of the legislature are defined and limited," he began, quoting Marbury v. Madison, "and that those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten. The Constitution is written." He laid out the history of the Commerce Clause, acknowledging its breadth but emphasizing its limits. He affirmed that Congress had substantial power to regulate the channels of interstate commerce. But then he pivoted. "However," he said, the word landing with quiet force, "that power is not a license for Congress to regulate any activity it deems important. By merely invoking the magic words interstate commerce, the court has a duty to inquire whether the legislative act is, in fact, a regulation of commerce, or whether it is something else entirely. While we typically afford great deference to Congress's stated findings, that deference is not absolute. It cannot be used to shield a legislative enactment from meaningful judicial review, especially when the law intrudes upon areas of traditional state sovereignty." He then addressed the memos directly. "In this case," he continued, "the petitioners have presented extraordinary evidence, in the form of the legislative drafter's own words, that the stated purpose of the Federal Data Privacy and Security Act was a pretext The record before us suggests that the primary goal was not to harmonize commercial regulations, but to establish a federal data access and surveillance framework, a goal whose constitutional basis is, to say the least, highly questionable. To uphold this law would be to endorse a theory of the Commerce Clause so broad that it would leave no corner of modern life outside of federal reach, and it would signal that the court will turn a blind eye to legislative craft that is designed to obscure, rather than clarify, its true purpose. He looked up from his papers for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. The Constitution did not establish a federal government of unlimited power. It established a system of dual sovereigns. For that system to function, the lines of authority, though sometimes blurry, must be respected. A law whose very foundation is a self-admitted pretext to circumvent those lines cannot stand. The judgment of the Court of Appeals is reversed. It was done. The vote was 6-3. The Chief Justice had been joined by the court's other conservative members and, in a surprising turn, by one of the liberal justices who wrote a concurring opinion emphasizing the unique nature of the evidence and the importance of holding Congress accountable for such a clear attempt to mislead. The news flashed across the globe. The FDPSA was struck down. Pam Bondi had won. The states had won. As she walked down the steps of the Supreme Court, past the waiting cameras, she didn't offer a triumphant speech. She simply smiled and said, "This is a good day for the Constitution." The story of the case became a legend in law schools, a case studied not just in federalism, but in the art of advocacy, the power of evidence, and the importance of timing. It was a reminder that even in an age of entrenched political divides and powerful institutions, the course of history could still be changed by a single, determined advocate armed with one simple, powerful thing, the undeniable truth. And it wasn't the shouting or the political spin that won the day. It was the quiet, damning words in a declassified memo, and the profound, history-altering silence of a Chief Justice who was stopped in his tracks, forced to confront a reality he could not ignore. The story's true end was not the reversal of a law, but the reaffirmation of a principle that in the hallowed halls of justice facts, stubbornly and persistently, still matter.